Hello everyone, my name is Emma and this is Learn from the Past, a channel where I geek out about cool history stuff and you hopefully learn some cool history stuff. Let's get started. Today we're going to be talking about the Lavendar Scare, the anti-gay crusade within the Red Scare. So to start out with, let's do a very brief overview of the Red Scare. So the US had long been worried about communism, seeing it as a threat to their capitalist society. These fears escalated with the globalization brought on by World War II. During the war, the US had fought on the same side as the Soviet Union, but they weren't allies in the genial sense of the word. It was more of the enemy of my friend type situation. When the war ended, the US turned its attention toward fighting the spread of communism, which was the dominant political force in the Soviet Union, as well as other previously allied countries, such as China. This led to a period of persecution and paranoia known as the Red Scare, in which federal employees were interrogated and fired for suspected communist leanings. This could mean passing state secrets to communist countries, the circulation of communist propaganda, or it could mean having once spoken to someone suspected of communist leanings. Within the Red Scare, there was a smaller, more subversive movement known as the Lavendar Scare. Federal employees at all levels were interrogated for suspected homosexuality, and those deemed to be gay were fired out of the fear that foreign agents, specifically communists, could exploit the employees' sexuality to blackmail state secrets out of them. It is this smaller movement, the Lavendar Scare, that we're going to discuss today. On February 9th, 1950, shortly after the end of World War II, Senator Joe McCarthy gave a speech on the Senate floor that quickly became infamous. In his speech, McCarthy alleged that communist spies had infiltrated all levels of US government and were selling state secrets to the country's enemies. This speech launched what became known as the Red Scare. Then, Undersecretary of State John Purifoy followed McCarthy's statement about communists in the federal government with a statement indicating that many of the people who had been fired were also gay. This sparked a national hysteria about gay people and created a link between communism and homosexuality in the minds of the American public. The Purifoy revelation that there were 91 gay people dismissed from the State Department set in motion a flurry of fear-mongering and finger-pointing that became known as the Lavendar Scare. The list of supposed security risks in the State Department presented by McCarthy on the floor of the Senate chamber was known as the Lee List, as it had been compiled by Senator Robert E. Lee in 1947. The Lee List continued to circulate even after those on it had been dismissed or exonerated, until it ended up on McCarthy's desk in February of 1950. McCarthy used the Lee List as the basis for his inflammatory speech on the Senate floor that incited the Lavendar Scare. Senator Styles Bridges then used the Lee List as an excuse to clean out the State Department. Bridges called the supposed homosexuals in Congress, quote, foul enemies of our republic, end quote, and charged that they were planted in the department as spies. Quote, they did not get there by osmosis or by accident. They got there because Russia wanted them there, end quote. Senator Miller Tydings of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee was tasked with investigating McCarthy's claims of infiltration. The Tydings Committee concluded that if there were any communists in the federal government, they didn't constitute a security risk, but McCarthyist hysteria had already taken hold of the country. In fact, the Tydings report didn't mention homosexuality at all, since Tydings didn't think it was relevant. This omission may have allowed the Lavendar Scare to spread out of control. McCarthy and Therefore, the general public began to conflate security risks with loyalty risks. That is to say, they began to conflate communism with gay people. Although the State Department frequently tried to rein this in, they were unsuccessful. The Red and Lavender Scares became one intertwined mass of hysteria. Many people at the time saw the Soviet Union's use of women in high-ranking positions and their progressive family leave policy as evidence of the moral corruption of communism. A large part of what we think of as 1950s culture was a direct result of anti-communist hysteria at the time. Prior to the McCarthy era, Washington, D.C. had a thriving underground gay community, but people began to leave to search for jobs elsewhere, either out of fear or because they'd already been fired. The Lavendar Scare demolished the gay community in D.C. D.C., being urban and therefore more tolerant than many small towns, enticed many young gay people to the city in the early 1930s, drawn to the jobs created by the New Deal. By the late 1940s, the gay subculture in DC was pretty open and uncloseted, which scared older conservatives like McCarthy. Politicians thought that DC was becoming more gay because Soviet spies were planning an infiltration. What was actually happening was just that DC was becoming a major city. Historian Alan Berube described World War II as a, quote, nationwide coming out experience, end quote. Gay people were becoming more visible and more talked about. In 1948, Alfred Kinsey published his research on American sexuality. Sexuality became the talking point of the national consciousness, and his report scared people with its vastly higher numbers of gay people than anticipated. Later that same year, the Miller sexual psychopath law was passed, making consensual adult sex with, quote, someone with the same sex organs, end quote, illegal. Heavy fines were imposed on adults participating in consensual gay sex. When Sumner Welles of President Franklin Roosevelt's cabinet was caught in a tryst with a black man, the resulting scandal was used for fodder by McCarthy. He pointed to it as proof that the Democrats were harboring sexual deviants. The public image of the State Department was changed. The general public seemed to think that everyone who worked there was gay. Much of the rhetoric of the Lavendar Scare talks about how susceptible gay people were to blackmail by communists. The idea being that communists could blackmail state secrets out of gay people by threatening to out them. No one seemed to think about what would happen if the Soviets threatened to out someone if they weren't already afraid of the consequences from the US government. If nothing were to happen, and everyone were to shrug it off, if the Soviets outed someone, the blackmail threat would lose all steam. But instead, the US government took to outing people preemptively. The State Department was targeted with rumors of homosexuality in its ranks because of its natural tendency toward diplomacy over war, which was seen as effeminate. The paradox of the Lavendar Scare is that the gay people in the State Department were seen as too weak and girly to really govern or to use militant foreign affairs tactics, but were simultaneously dangerously powerful and with more control than they should have over US politics. Echoing the Army's rationale during the war, the State Department dismissed gay candidates as a morale problem for the straight men and women already working there. In 1946, bills began being associated with the McCarran Rider, a stipulation that allowed heads of federal departments to dismiss any employee at any time for any reason. This would make it easier to get rid of suspected gay people without the hassle of severance pay or unlawful termination lawsuits. The discourse of national security tried to exploit fears that there was no way to tell apart gay people and straight people. This fear can be traced in part to the 1948 publication of the Kinsey Report. The government tried to use the numbers published by the Kinsey Report to prove that gay people were a security risk, but All they managed to prove was that there were probably more gay Americans than they thought.